Well, I guess the best way to describe this is that we live in an uncertain and insecure world. I guess that's the best way to describe it. And the reason that we elect politicians and we like things like Parliament and all those sorts of legal bodies to exist is to give some certainty in these uncertain times and to be able to establish what the rules are for all so that we can be aware of that. But there are new ideas being promoted continually. Actually, just our last guest, Mātauranga Māori, for example, was never mainstream. It's becoming mainstream, but nobody quite knows. Well, not everybody knows what it means, and Simon of Court got into trouble for suggesting that defining what that is so that we could all be better aware was found to be in breach of where the government was going on that particular issue. But somebody who is making great hay while the sun shines, I guess, on the co-governance issue is Graeme Edgeler, who has the former real estate agent, business person. I think he was a school teacher as well, from memory, for many years, is touring the country on what's known as a Stop Co-Governance tour. And he's spoken to Sean on a number of occasions on this particular platform. The reason that the platform have been prepared to give to anybody on this particular issue, on either side, a particular view, is that co-governance is a relatively new concept in the way in which it is being defined currently. It is affecting public institutions and agencies, and it is being applied in often uneven ways across the public fabric of this country. Graeme Edgeler is opposed to that concept. He believes very strongly in the idea of one person, one vote, and that no culture nor ethnicity should have precedent over any other. And that's a perfectly understandable philosophical viewpoint, and he has been involved in that issue. But it may appear that his co-governance tour, which has, as I said, been touring the country for much of the last year and appears to be self-funded in actual fact, is going to run awry of government regulations and legislation connected with election and political advertising. And joining us to talk about that and to see if indeed it has already is lawyer and blogger and expert public commentator Graeme Edgeler, and he joins us now. Graeme, thank you very much. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Graeme, what's the story at the moment? What is as you would understand this better than I, what have the Electoral Commission said to Mr. Edgeler about his current campaign?
Well, it's not really about the campaign as a whole. I'd say what I've seen the letter they sent him. They've got a particular booklet. I haven't looked at anything else. There are videos and they've got a website. Don't know any of that. But the booklet that he's making available to people, I think online and probably in print as well, they've said it looks to them like an election advertisement. And there are certain rules before you can publish an election advertisement, and extra rules that apply for spending on election advertisements during the 3 months ahead of the election. And they've asked him, hey, do you want to have a response to this before we decide what to do next? And, I've looked at that, and, for the most part, it's almost got nothing to do with the election. It really is, it's about co-governance, and it's not talking about the election for most of the time, but you get near the end, action you can take. Don't vote for any political party which supports co-governance. And if you look at the definition of election advertisement in the Electoral Act, means an advertisement that encourages you to vote or not to vote for a party of a type described by their positions, their views on a particular issue, whether or not the name of the party is stated. And that's don't vote for any party which is going to continue co-governance. That makes that bit of the leaflet is about the election.
Okay,
so the rules around election advertising apply, is the argument from the Electoral Commission.
Okay, Graeme, first of all, just to get this right, you can advertise, can you, as long as you acknowledge that you are, and that you, put the name of the person who's authorised this under the bottom, or you can't advertise at all?
You can, if you do that with what we call the promoter statement. The person who is behind the advertisement has to have their name and some form of contact details on it, and exactly what counts as contact details is written in the Act.
So are you saying that even if he was found to be in breach currently, or that particular document was found to be in breach of the government's or the spending rules around election advertising, all he would need to do would be to affix a little label saying authorised by Julian Batchelor, blah, blah, blah?
To make it, to follow one bit of the legislation, yes. There's a second bit, so that's about publishing advertising, and that's basically all you need to do to have a lawfully published advertisement. The next bit for him is about spending, and most of the 2 years, 9 months out of the election of the term of Parliament, no spending limits. 3 months before the election, once we know what the election date is, and we know what the election date is, then there's spending limits. And there's spending limits for candidates, there's spending limits for parties, and there's spending limits for sort of other people trying to influence how we want to vote. And so if you're spending more, I forget, sort of 15,700, then you've got to register with the Electoral Commission.
Oh, really?
Say, hey, I'm going to be spending, which is, that's a lot of money for most people to spend on anything, right? So it's not hard, not complicated. Like, I don't think there's a fee or anything. It's just like, I'm the person behind this. It's more than me sort of posting on a website, spending a few $100 or whatever. You're spending 15,000 it's inflation adjusted, 15,700, something like that. Register with the Electoral Commission. Okay,
and that
which isn't complicated for him to do. Yeah. And then the next thing, and I forget what the overall is, then after that, if you do register, then you can spend, I forget what it is.
It's $100,000.
150, 100,000, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And so within that 3 month period, if he registers, puts his name and address on it, and isn't spending more than $100,000 or whatever it is during that 3 month period, then he can keep going.
Yeah, I'm actually reading the...
under the Electoral Act anyway.
So I'm actually reading this now. It's an odd thing, but registered third-party promoters can spend up to $391,000.
Yeah, I thought it was a bit hard than that. I just I should have checked before I came on exactly what they hear. It's sort of... We first created this after the Exclusive Brethren, the advertising campaign.
Is that where it's from?
And they'd always had to have the name and address thing on it, which was sort of what the Exclusive Brethren got in trouble for. But then there was the question of, if a party is only allowed to spend $3 million, that's somewhere around there on election advertising, and candidates are only allowed to spend sort of, at the time it was, 20,000, 25,000, something like that. Is it right that someone else can run an anti-candidate advertising, spending even more than the candidate could spend defending themselves? And so that was when we sort of started creating limits, and they've fluctuated a bit and changed here and there. But there's a limit, and it's quite a high limit, 300,000 or whatever it is. And so, that's more than the vast majority of people could ever hope to spend. So it's not sort of, it's not highly restrictive unless you're wanting to spend, almost as much as a political party.
I guess the pushback that...
he can advertise it and he can run these. If he took out the bit with don't vote, to be perfectly honest, I don't think it would be about the election at all, and he wouldn't even have to have his name on it. But that's the bit that I suspect the Electoral Commission's looked at. Don't vote if parties do this. And it's that's kind of, it's about the election, isn't it? It's not about, it is about co-governance, but it's also about the election. When you've got the sort of recommendation to everyone, don't vote for any political party which is going to continue with co-governance.
But again,
talking about the election.
I guess it does, but I guess that's a pretty... his response to that could it, Graeme, something along the lines of, I haven't actually said not to vote for Labour or...
it doesn't have to. Doesn't it? Yes, you could certainly say that, and that makes it slightly. But to be honest, I think his better response is, this isn't an advertisement at all.
Right.
This is an e-book. This isn't what it's designed to cover.
Right.
And I think the Electoral Commission will disagree with that. I don't think it's a ridiculous argument. But again, I don't know how much he's spending. If he wants to spend, register with the Electoral Commission, which is it's an online form. There isn't even a fee to do it. Tell them your name. I'm spending a bit of money on this, and I think it's important. I'm prepared to put my name on it.
Yeah.
And then suddenly,
It goes away.
The Electoral Commission, it'll go away as long as he's not spending more than like $250,000 in that 3 month period. You can spend more than that, just, in the 3 months before the election. On the advertising bit, that's the limit. Spending on the public meetings, spending on the whatever else he's doing. There's other rules around the bribery or whatever. I'm no suggesting anything like that. There's lots of other rules to comply with, but we're talking about this thing here where he's been sent the letter by the Electoral Commission. As long as he's not spending $250,000 in the next 3 months, this is something he's able to do.
I note
legally under the electoral.
I note under the Electoral Commission's website that a number of organisations have done just as you've suggested, and ones that might particularly hold, say, similar views, like New Zealand Taxpayers Union, Groundswell, the Hobson's Pledge, for example. They've all registered themselves as promoters, along with the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, Nurses Organisation, who usually get involved in some way, shape or form, Greenpeace, Forest and Bird, etc. So it's not you're saying it's not an onerous
It's not
task.
onerous. It's, you have to be someone living in New Zealand, and you have to tell them your name and address.
And if you spend over $100,000, you have to send the Electoral Commission a return of what you spent it on, up to a total of $392,000.
Yes.
Yeah.
In that 3 month period. So bits before, the bits after, and it's again only on advertising. If he's spending money on holding meetings or spending money on petrol to get to meetings or flights or whatever, none of that is included. This is the only spending limit is on advertising.
Can I ask the next question?
Advertising, which is election advertising.
If he puts his toe, or he digs his toes in and says, no, this isn't election advertising, I think you've interpreted wrongly, are there any particular sanctions that the Electoral Commission can implement that would be of any moment to Mr. Batchelor?
Well, not the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission doesn't prosecute people, but it is an offence. It's not a... if he was to spend more than that spending limit, that's sort of when you get the serious offences. They would refer it to the police, potentially. Police would decide whether to investigate and whether to prosecute, as with most offences. I think this one, the advertising rules are a fine-only offence. So it's not something you can go to prison over or anything like that. The spending rules, if he deliberately spent over the 309,000, whatever it is, knew that was the limit and deliberately did that, that's where you can sort of get in real trouble. I don't know how much he's spending. I would be surprised if it was that much within the 3 months. And so, it's an offence. Someone could prosecute him. He could go to court. He couldn't be arrested because it's not an arrestable offence. It's a fine offence. Someone would summons him, and he'd have to turn up, get a lawyer, and say to a judge, "I've got a defence. This isn't an advertisement. It's a booklet."
Okay.
About co-governance.
And thank you for providing the background to that, because I was trying to work out where the background to this bill came from, and of course it was the Exclusive Brethren. I think that was a very similar election to this one, actually, in some ways. Parties very close. 2005, Don Brash, Exclusive Brethren. What was Graeme, just remind me of that though, but what was the issue there, that they were directly campaigning for a change in government, yeah?
They had a few different advertisements. So I think there were most of them were, there was an anti-green delusion pamphlet they sent to just about every household in the country.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And there what they got in more trouble, and that would have been fine, I think, under the rules at the time. They had their name in a PO box on, which was allowed at the time, I think. And you just, who are these people? J. Smith, PO Box 42. Like, how do you find out who that is? I think the bit. None of them got prosecuted. The bit that got them in trouble and potentially investigated was an advertisement which seemed like it was pro-national. So that's an extra rule that this booklet doesn't, I would say, there's no even suggestion it's broken. Anti-party advertising is one thing. If he was to say, vote for ACT or vote for the Green Party, whatever he was going to say, that's a lot more restrictive. The Green Party's got a spending limit. They can spend $3 million around about, somewhere around there, on election advertising during the 3 months. And you can't spend extra to take them over. If I want to support them and say, vote for the Green Party, I can send a tweet or something like that. But if I'm spending money on it, well, their spending limit's $3 million.
Yeah.
National spending limit when Don Brash 2005 was $2.5 million under rules at the time, and the exclusive brethren then spent another 800,000 or million, saying in one of their advertisements seemed to be very much vote for National, and so that was sort of a different rule. And Julian does not seem to have done anything like that here. I don't know, don't assume he would. This is very much be careful, don't vote for these people rather than vote for these people. And so that was, I think, one of the extra things that was different in that case was there were rules around you can potentially do it, but you need sort of the party's permission because it's going to come within their spending limit. If you're running advertising, vote for a particular party, then it's got to come towards their spending limit. Otherwise, if they can spend, their spending limit's $3 million and I'll spend 300,000 and you spend 300,000 and suddenly they're spending $5 million, which is more than anyone else. And so specific rules about pro-party and pro-candidate advertising, naming vote for this person rather than don't vote for this person. Nothing I can see in what I've looked at of Julian's approaches that. But that was one of the differences, I think, that made a bit of a difference in Exclusive Brethren. One of their advertisements very much, or at least seemed to possibly was vote for National. And so that makes it a little more serious isn't quite the right word, but why the electoral authorities at the time, or why you certainly would take that more seriously, was the different, National's got a spending limit. You're sort of undermining that spending limit if you can spend your own money pushing their message.
Okay.
But vote against,
So really, to summarise this, your argument would be that this really isn't the Electoral Commission trying to inhibit the freedom of speech of Julian Batchelor. It's just trying to bring him within the rules, but he could resist it. But even if he wanted to, probably the easiest route would be just to register as a promoter like everybody else.
The Free Speech Union, everyone else you pointed out as applied. It's the type of thing that if you're an organisation like Greenpeace or the Free Speech Coalition or Hobson's Pledge, you probably know that these rules exist.
Yeah. And
I'm not a political party. For some sort of individual, one of the sort of slight problems of it, there's a bit more technical detail in our election regulation around advertising and spending now, and you just might not sort of appreciate it. Well, I'm just one guy. It doesn't apply to me. That's organisations or something like that, and you could easily make that sort of mistake. Or not even think about it, because you're thinking, I'm talking about co-governance, I'm not talking about the election, but when you say don't vote for a political party, suddenly the Electoral Commission thinks, oh, that's election advertising. And it's not a ridiculous argument to say, well, he says don't vote. Of course it's election advertising.
Okay. Graeme, thank you very much for clarifying and explaining that to us. Much appreciated. You have a very good day, my friend. As Graeme Edgeler, a public law lawyer and a bit of an expert on electoral matters. You might see this, you might not see it, but certainly Sean was breaking the story, I think, this morning. That he was actually prior to not being here, but he was breaking the story this morning. The Electoral Commission had written and suggested to Julian Batchelor that he was in breach of the law. That had been perceived by Mr. Batchelor, I'm sure, as something of a chastening bid upon his freedom of free speech and thought. But is he trying to influence public opinion? Of course he is. Otherwise, why would you be carrying out a co-governance tour? Are you trying to get people to put people in place who would stop co-governance? Well, I think Mr. Batchelor would be the first to admit that he is. And then there is a whole series of other sponsors who are trying to do pretty much the same thing. You'll see campaigns run by NZEI, PPTA, Forest and Bird is another one I was thinking of, Greenpeace. They tend not to say vote Labour, vote Greens, vote Te Pāti Māori, but they raise issues that they ask the audience to look at. Hobson's Choice, Groundswell, what's the other one? Talked about Taxpayers Union. They're all on the other side, perhaps, of what might be considered the left-right political divide. But they, in every instant, have registered themselves as sponsors with the Electoral Commission. And it won't stop them from spending up to $392,000 advertising it. And although Mr. Batchelor, I'm sure, is very wealthy, I can't imagine he'll be spending $392,000 from this month to the election, but I could be wrong. So that's the background to that particular story.